Well, hello, everybody. My name is Ruth Wishart, and I'm hoping to get two distinguished economists to talk about the Sustainable Growth Commission in plain English. This is essential since Dr. Tim Rideout is an economist who's also convener of the Scottish Currency Group and the man who famously crafted an amendment at 2019 SNP conference which essentially removed the SGC's 6 tests in favour of establishing a Scottish pound as soon as possible. George Kerevan, now a columnist with The National, has had a previous incarnation as an SNP MP and a senior lecturer in economics. He's also a founder member of the new Now Scotland grassroots movement. I have to say, I am something of a contrast. I am the woman who failed O-grade mathematics for the 3rd time in her 6th year at secondary school. In short, I'm here to ask the daft lassie questions. So let's start with you, Tim. I watched your lecture on why the Growth Commission 6 tests were essentially asking the wrong questions. So what are the main things you believe it got wrong?
Well, I think that the 6 tests they're either things which have already been achieved, or they're impossible to achieve, or they're not relevant. So, for example, they talk about whether we have a credible central bank. Well, central banks are only credible once they're actually running a currency and doing the job. So, the European Central Bank had been running for 10 years at the time of the Greek crisis, and people were still saying, is it a credible central bank? So that's an example of a test that you can't actually meet beforehand. Something which was irrelevant, for example, is a test which says, does the proposed new currency meet the needs of business and people? Well, it's complete nonsense, because any currency meets the needs of business and people. In the South Pacific Islands in the 18th century, they used to use cowrie shells as a currency, and that worked perfectly well. And then
I presume that's not what you envisaged for us, Tim.
No, of course it isn't. Currencies are really not that difficult, and many people will, in fact, have set up their own currency, because if you've been part of a babysitting circle where you've had some sort of token, like I think my parents used to use ice lolly sticks, then you issue everyone with 2 or 3 ice lolly sticks, and then they can use those to pay for the babysitter, and then it makes everyone have to take their turn, because otherwise you run out of the token, and you only get more by doing your stint of babysitting for somebody else.
Okay, well, I actually favour bottles of white wine, but each to their own. George, you were involved in the startup of the Scottish Growth Commission. I mean, you were in on the ground floor of it. So what, in your opinion, went wrong?
It might be worth just explaining what happened. 2016, you remember the Brexit vote. Scottish SNP leadership suddenly thought we were going to have a referendum very quickly. We were all sent out to gather 1 million signatures, but clearly we needed an economic strategy for post-independence to talk about during the referendum campaign. Everyone was more or less agreed that the thing that had gone wrong in 2014 was the absence of a credible position on the currency. We'd been committed to just using the pound and being part of the pound structure. There's polling evidence that really confused people, and of course, it gave the other side the argument, we won't let you use the pound. So as soon as the Growth Commission was announced, I phoned up my old mate, Andrew Wilson, the ultimate author of the document, and said, come and let's have a chat. And I was an MP at the time. So Andrew flew down to London, and we met together with Ian Blackford and Roger Mullen. We had a nice dinner in a London watering hole on Andrew Wilson's expense account, and we discussed what to do. And the whole tenor of the discussion was the Growth Commission report is about providing the arguments from moving away from keeping the pound to an argument for why we need our own currency after independence and how we will create it. Now, it also happened that at that point, there was no research apparatus in Scotland within the SNP to produce their Sustainable Commission report. And so it was agreed then and there that the MPs in London, because there were 56 of us, and we had money, we had a research apparatus. The wonderful Miriam Brett was our head of economics research full time, decided that we, the MPs, would take charge of doing the basic research and for the commission. So we started, and then came the 2017 general election, snap election. Some of us got booted out, myself included, and suddenly everything seemed to go quiet on the commission front. But what was really happening was that the Commission had hired a whole series of very serious global research companies. And I don't know how that got funded. Still to this day, don't know how it got funded. And they produced an entirely different report, which ultimately was all about keeping the pound. And when I eventually asked Andrew Wilson what had precipitated the change, he said they had discussed with the banks and the financial community. The financial community was worried about moving to Scottish currency, and so they'd gone back to the initial idea.
Sterlingization.
The pound, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me pick up on a couple of these points with Tim, because I read an interview very recently with Andrew Dunlop, who, if we remember, was David Cameron's man in Better Together. And he made the point that George has just emphasised, that really the failure to answer the currency question, and indeed to have a proper fiscal strategy, was what hold the yes camp below the waterline in 2014. And I'm not sure that I disagree with that, but do you?
No, I thought it was a mistake at the time. I wasn't particularly involved beyond leafleting in the branch and that sort of thing, but I thought, well, this isn't the right plan, but I assume that Salmon and etc. know what they're doing, and turned out that they didn't. The only plan that works politically, can stand up to any attack, is to say we're going to do what every other country does and have our own currency. And nobody can attack that. If you say we're going to use, we're going to have a currency union with the rest of the UK, well, that gives London a veto. If you say we're going to informally use sterling, well, that's exceptionally dangerous, and I think it's politically vulnerable, because all that the No campaign has to do is say, no, you won't. You'll do what everyone else does and have their own currency.
Well, let me just be devil's advocate here, Tim, because I noticed in the course of that lecture, which you gave admittedly some years ago now, but you said that the thing about having our own currency was that people would have a choice, that they would be able to choose whether or not to use the Scottish pound, or whatever we call it, or indeed to leave their savings or whatever in sterling. That would be their choice. Now, you also said that further down the line, they would find it using anything other than the Scottish pound pretty inconvenient. So they would, in time, gradually, we'd all migrate one way or another to using the Scottish pound. I want to know how you can be so sure of that.
It's a voluntary exchange, so people, we're Scots, so we're going to be a bit canny about it, and I think a lot of people will change a bit of their savings, and they'll keep the rest in sterling. Now that means that they'd keep their existing bank account, and their sterling bank accounts would be part of the banks will have to split. So if you take Tesco Bank, for example, all the sterling part will be a UK bank, and the Scottish pound part would be a Scottish bank. So if you keep your sterling account, it will actually be in England and not in Scotland. So you can, there's nothing to stop people having a euro account or a dollar account or any other account. So you can keep your savings in sterling if that's what you want to do. But when you spend some money in Scotland, it will be in Scottish pounds. So what's going to happen is, if you're using what is now a foreign debit card, then you'll get same as if you're in Spain. You'll get, it converts. You'll get 2.5% added on for currency conversion.
George, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, the simple thing is, Ruth, that the Scottish government will mandate you and companies, you as individual and companies as companies, to pay their taxes in the Scottish pound. So you'll need Scottish pounds. That's a simple way you nudge people along to using a domestic currency.
Well, the other question, of course, for people in my demographic, i.e. the chronologically gifted, the other question they have, of course, is what's going to happen to my pension? Will I be financially as secure as before? Because that really does matter to people. I mean, to use that old Wilsonian phrase, the pound in their pocket really has a lot of, if I can use a terrible pun, a lot of currency with people in that age group. How do we reassure them? Tim first and then George.
Well, I mean, there's two elements to pensions. So there's the state pension and then there's private pensions. And so far as the state pension is concerned, it's an unfunded scheme. So the money for it comes from the national insurance contributions that we pay in. Now, legally speaking, the UK has accepted the national insurance, and it's always been fairly clear to people that if you've paid enough, 35 years worth of contributions, then you will get your pension, whether you live in the UK or Poland or Spain or South Africa or anywhere else. In principle, the UK would pay the pensions, but I think as part of the negotiations over the divorce, since Scotland will be taking over the tax revenues, there's probably a deal to be done by which Scotland takes over paying the UK state pension, and it becomes the basis for the Scottish state pension instead. The SNP has already approved a policy to gradually raise the Scottish state pension to the EU average, which would be about £300 a week instead of the 156 you get for the UK state pension.
Yes, I think on the more positive side, George, that is something that a lot of people understand, that just how small a pension they get compared with a lot of their European compatriots with whom we could make a reasonable comparison.
Indeed. I mean, the state pension that you're desperately trying to defend in the UK is a pittance. Now, as we said, the UK state, even after Scottish independence, has a legal obligation to pay people the pension that they accrued from their taxes over the previous 35 years. So that doesn't change. And if you've got a professional pension, then that doesn't change either. This is a legal obligation for you to be paid, which leaves the independent Scottish government in the handsome position that it could actually use its resources to increase the state pension to something like the European average, which you can actually live on. So we should turn this argument into something positive rather than to something negative.
Okay, well, let's just look at, as I say here as the hired devil's advocate, let's look at another part of the fiscal argument that keeps popping up every time there's any kind of public debate, and that is all the semantics around debt and deficits. Now, we know that the Scottish government is not allowed to run up a debt, but we also know that in terms of our share of the UK debt post-independence, we keep getting told there's going to be a huge black hole and we're going to start life as an independent nation with this huge deficit. Tim, why is this wrong? And if it is, why?
Well, firstly, so far as the UK national debt is concerned, people say we should have to take 8% of it, 100 billion or something like that. No. Because when the UK breaks up, it's going to follow the Vienna Convention of what's called the continuing state. And the UK has already declared in 2014, unilaterally with no discussion, that they were going to be the continuing state. And the continuing state keeps the assets, like the seat on the UN Security Council, and it takes the liabilities, so the debt. So, you can't take the assets and palm the debt off on somebody else. So, we have no responsibility whatsoever to take any UK national debt or any share of it, and it's not actually really a debt. It's actually the UK national savings. It's your premium bonds or your national insurance certificates and things like that.
But, I mean, George, just to move this on a bit, I would have thought that we had at least a moral responsibility, if not a legal responsibility, to take a share of that debt which was accrued on our behalf. I'm not talking about things that the UK government did that we didn't want. I'm thinking perhaps Trident, but things that they did on our behalf, from which we did benefit. Don't we have a moral responsibility there?
Well, let's just be clear, because it confuses people. There's a difference between the accumulated debt, the total debt that UK state has run up, and the annual deficit, the annual kind of difference between what you raise in taxes and what you spend. So we're talking at the moment about the accumulated national debt. Right. Clearly, some of that debt was used to fund investment spending in Scotland, infrastructure, roads, and so on. Okay, so you can argue that even though there is no legal obligation on a seceding state such as Scotland to pay repay some of the debt of the successor main state, which would be rest of UK. There's no legal obligation, as Tim said. But as you say, because some of the money was spent in Scotland, I think we might feel there's as responsible citizens some kind of moral obligation. Also, politics is involved here. I suspect that if a new Scottish government simply repudiated any responsibility for the UK national debt, then that might make we'd find difficulties in international markets from taking that stand. No, I don't justify that. I'm just saying, being pragmatic, that might be the case.
The thing about that, though, Tim, is that if we learn one thing from the Brexit negotiations, is that going in with all guns blazing is no way to get a good settlement. So starting off by saying sorry, we've got no obligation to pay any of that debt and we're not going to, doesn't seem to me perhaps the cuddliest way to begin negotiations.
Firstly, if you go back over the last 40 years, then Scotland actually paid in of something like 300 billion from oil revenues as a surplus, and so we're saying we should take back 100 billion, so that leaves 200 billion that we actually contributed more than our share. However, I mean, if we agreed, for example, to take over the state pension and relieve the UK of that responsibility, you could take that as our share of paying towards the UK. So, I'm not saying we're just going to have a shouting match in terms of negotiations, but there are things to negotiate, and I think you don't start the negotiation by putting a checkbook on the table. That might be the end result, that we agree to pay say a share of the interest cost or something like that.
No, you don't start it by putting a ski and do in the table either, though, do you?
No, but you have to have a starting position, and I think then you have to see how the negotiations go. And there's all sorts of things, like the UK wishes to retain occupation of Fas Lane, so that's something that they want, which we'd be a bit reluctant to give them.
I'm very glad to hear it, because I live here. People have always worried about what happens afterwards in terms. So we have a new currency, we set up our own bank, etc., etc. But what happens if there's a run on the new currency, or what happens if they're just deliberate attempts to sabotage our arrangements any which way?
Yeah, well, first of all, it harks back to the previous question. In this divorce, there are assets to be split up, and Scotland will get a very large share of the UK's assets, as well as any notional responsibility for debt. And those assets stand behind the currency that we create. And when we create a currency, if you issue Scottish
what assets? Let's spell out what assets you have in mind.
Land. I mean, the UK state owns huge amounts of land across the islands. I think the MOD owns about 1.5% of Scottish land area. There's buildings, there's property all around the world, there's the military assets, there's all the money in the Bank of England. I mean, we get our share, 8 to 10% of that. So that stands behind any currency. But very clear point: if you're issuing a new currency, if I sell you, if I'm the Scottish Central Bank, and I print a Scottish pound and sell it to you, you give me dollars, you give me euros, you give me British pounds, and that immediately goes into our currency reserves. So by issuing a currency, you create the reserves that back it.
You made that point actually in your lecture, Tim. So would you like to elaborate on that?
Well, I think the Scottish Reserve Bank could end up with quite easily something like sort of 30 or 40 billion of foreign reserves. I wouldn't actually ask for 8% of the Bank of England's reserves. I'd let them have that, because we don't really need it. It would only be $8 billion, because they don't actually have very many reserves. But we're not going to have to worry about reserves. And the point about the currency markets is that when the currency is created, the only people who have any are people in Scotland who've asked for it. So in terms of the international market and speculators, they don't have any Scottish pounds. So it's quite difficult to play the market with something you haven't got.
Would you peg the currency to anything?
No. I mean, the central bank will intervene, as all central banks do, to smooth out fluctuations and ensure that nothing, you don't suddenly have big drops or rises or anything like that. But no, I wouldn't peg it, because that's a bit. It's quite difficult. It opens you then up to a tax if you get the peg at the wrong level, as the UK did in 1991. So I think it's much better to let the exchange rate float, and that provides an insulating defence mechanism for the domestic economy that allows adjustments to take place in the exchange rate. Whereas if you peg, then adjustments would have to take place in terms of things like prices, wages, and employment.
In other words, George, we've got to avoid a tartan Black Wednesday.
Yeah, well, that was for people who don't know, that was when the UK government back in the 90s tried to protect the value of the pound against all comers, and of course that always fails. So Tim is quite right. I mean, there should be no obligation on the Scottish government to fix the price of the Scottish pound or the price of vegetables or anything. That wouldn't stop you, as is the norm, having your central bank guide the value of your currency so that it didn't oscillate hugely in the short term. But then we're getting a bit technical. But essentially, Tim's right. we'll let the pound find its own, the Scottish pound find its own level, and therefore we can't have a run against it.
But I want to get into some of the arguments that are deployed constantly by the unionists, and these are arguments that they didn't have the last time round. These are new arguments because of the contemporary situation, and they say ubiquitously that being in the middle of a pandemic is no time to create further uncertainty. Tim, first of all, then George, how do you feel about that?
I don't think it's particularly worse than any other time. By the time at the moment, we're talking about having the referendum, some sort of vote on independence. I mean, that's not going to be anything less than at least sort of 9 months away, probably more likely early next year. I think we should hopefully have got to the end of the pandemic by then, with everyone vaccinated. So I don't see that. I don't see that being a problem. An actual independence would probably be another 2 years after that. So you're talking about maybe 2024 by that stage. So that that's quite a long way in the future. And until you get to Independence Day itself, not a lot's going to change.
Well, a very strong new argument for independence is the sheer incompetence of the Tory government in London in handling the pandemic, which has led to over 100,000 poor people dead. Right, that's the serious of the issues we're talking about. Right, an independent Scotland that used the pound would not have been able to borrow, would not be able to fund the lockdown. I mean, if you're going to be independent, then you have to have your own currency, and that counts double in a pandemic situation where you need the borrowing powers of a domestic currency to be able to deal with the economic consequences.
Okay, now there's a kind of related question here, which is that post-COVID, everybody's economy is going to be a shambles. I mean, there's no way around that. So how do we avoid a Scottish government, a new Scottish independent government, having to apply its own version of austerity?
Well, I'm gonna be a bit controversial here.
Surely not.
The norm in the last 20, 30 years under this horrible thing called neoliberalism is that the view is that states should be small, taxes should be low, government shouldn't borrow. Actually, I mean, borrowing is a good thing. I mean, you borrow to buy your house, don't you? Most people borrow multiples of their income to buy their house. We consider that a good thing as an investment in the future. It's the same with the government. Provided you're borrowing for the right thing, the issue is not the scale of the borrowing. So austerity shouldn't be an issue, right? The issue is good governance and what the government borrows to spend on. And I think Scottish government, independent government, closer to home would be in a much better position to choose wisely what to spend on, and therefore borrowing should not be an issue.
Well, if we adopted, say, the Green New Deal that Richard Murphy proposes for Scotland, so that would be spending maybe 10 billion a year on insulating every house and business premise in Scotland, for example, electrifying all the remaining railways, district heating schemes, and so forth. If the return on that investment was, say, 5% per annum, and the borrowing cost is 0.5 or 1% per annum, so effectively you're getting a 4% return on your investment. Well, if it was a business looking at it, they'd do it. So why shouldn't the state do it? You're creating a return for future generations. So you should be borrowing even more when it's that's profitable to make the investment.
Okay, one final question for both of you. We started off talking about the Scottish Growth Commission and your reservations about it. I want you to draw me a picture of what the new Scotland would look like if we adopted the Growth Commission's proposals, and what it would look like if we ditched them.
Well, I've characterised the Growth Commission as being technocratic managerialism. So it has no vision for Scotland at all. We're going to have a little bit more immigration, a little bit of a tweak to productivity, a little bit more investment, and at the end of 30 years, we'll all be a little bit better off. I'm afraid that's not a vision for selling independence. What we could do is, go down the Green New Deal route, decarbonise the economy. We can become the renewable energy centre of Europe. I think Scotland has something like 50% of the total energy resources available from wind and tidal power. So we could be, that could be the new oil of exporting energy, throughout Europe, and developing our industries, our agriculture, sorting out the land question, all of those sort of things, getting rid of all the poverty and children growing up in deprived situations and things like that. That's what people want independence for, is to change. We don't want just slightly more of the same of, but slightly better.
George?
the top priority of the Growth Commission is to curb public spending. Now, that's a nonsense. It was a nonsense when it was written. It's a nonsense now, especially with the pandemic and the economic consequences of the pandemic. So the Growth Commission report is history. What we need is investment. As one good thing the Growth Commission report points out is that Scotland is unique amongst the small industrial economies of Western Europe. It has such a low level of investment annually. So we need investment. That can only come really through the state and a state investment bank.
Actually, I said that was the last question. I've got one more probably. Do either of you think there is enough work being done at the moment to bolster this alternative vision that you've both shared with us?
Well, beyond what we're trying to do in the Scottish Currency Group of getting the central bank off the ground, then, so as far as the rest of the SNP or the Scottish government's concerned, I don't think there's any work going on detailed plans for independence. Certainly the Scottish government very briefly had 7 people looking at it for about 6 months in 2019, and that was disbanded as soon as the pandemic broke out. Nothing's happened since.
I mean, as Tim says, all of the research work is being done first of the SNP and first of the Scottish government. For instance, Commonweal think tank has done a lot of research into the Green New Deal. Sadly, we keep being told that there's going to be a referendum each and every year, but you can't have a referendum really and win it unless you have a detailed economic plan. And that's desperately what we need.
Okay, well, listen, thanks both to Tim Rideout and George Kerevan, because from my point of view as the non-economist in this discussion, I'm comforted that there are guys like that who are watching our backs. Thank you both very much.